The Heir Clause at Silver Creek, when love breaks the contract. A man can buy a mountain and rename it after himself. He can seed the air with turbines, bend a river with algorithms, even bully a whole frontier town into nodding when he passes. But there's one thing a ledger can't guarantee, no matter how many zeros it carries: a beating future with your name stitched into it. On the Perseus fringe, where the trade routes dim and the stars sharpen to needles, the Silver Creek colony survived by discipline and luck and the iron will of one man, Clyde Bonner. He had a clause to satisfy. The founding charter demanded a legal heir or an acknowledged family co-governor within 6 years, or Silver Creek would be repossessed by core world syndicates that never dirted their boots. 1 year left on the clock. One problem: Clyde had sworn off romance the way spacers swear off cracked hulls. So he posted a notice. Not a love letter. A contract. Seeking a woman who desires a child and can provide a good home influence. No romance required. Wealth and security guaranteed. Must be willing to live on ranch. 2 jumps and 1 bad memory away, Lydia Voss read that message in a rented cubicle above Des Moines Orbital Station and felt something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time: dangerous, flammable hope. 32 years old, a planetary schoolteacher with a tidy mind and a heart that had learned to hold itself very still, she'd collected 5 different rejections from 5 different arrangements. Too plain. Too principled. Too much teacher voice. Too much her. Clyde didn't want a partner, his ad made that clear. He wanted an outcome. And Lydia, quiet, focused Lydia, wanted a child to love and a home that didn't echo at night. It was a practical overlap, a clean intersection of needs. But here is what the frontier knows and the core forgets: contracts are written for steady skies. Out on the rim, storms change the math. This is the story of how a no-romance clause met a human soul, how a colony held together by timetables and turbine noise learned that the warmest technology in the universe is 2 people choosing each other. There will be ion storms and hungry men with fast ships. There will be old wounds and new promises. There will be a library full of poetry in a world that treats feeling like an operational risk. And there will be a woman who walks off a shuttle with a satchel of certificates and a spine of iron, and a man who thinks he can account for everything except his own heart. Settle in. Silver Creek is about to test its definitions of wealth, legacy, and what it really means to be human out where nothing is obligated to care. Chapter 1: The Ad Between the Stars. Lydia Voss read the notice 7 times, though the words refused to evolve into anything softer. Seeking a woman who desires a child and can provide a good home influence. No romance required. Wealth and security guaranteed. Must be willing to live on ranch. Right to C. Bonner, Silver Creek, Perseus Outer. Her fingers traced the crisp font projected above the flimsy metal desk, as if contact might warm it. Beyond the thin bulkhead of her one-room rental, Des Moines Orbital was a hive: freight drones whining past, public address pings stacking like impatient knocks, a baby crying somewhere down the corridor, then soothed by a voice that knew exactly what it was doing. Lydia closed her eyes and listened hard to that voice, to the rhythm of comfort, and felt the old ache press at her sternum. She was a good teacher. She knew that the way astronauts know which way is down by watching the coffee. 8 years of multiplication tables and phonetic drills and the high, falling laughter when a tough idea finally clicked. 8 years of little hands gripping her fingers at recess because, Miss Voss, come see, the beetle has chrome wings. Then, every evening, 8 years of keying into an apartment that held only air and patterns of dust. 5 almosts had taught her the frontier's particular cruelty. On Kansas Station, a widower had appraised her like equipment. "You've got too much schoolroom in your step," he'd said, not unkindly. On the Colorado Rim a prospector had called her hands teacher's hands, meaning not soft enough for his imagination. Nebraska belt, a laugh when she quoted Whitman and meant it. A mother-in-law candidate in South Dakota Hab Cluster had cut the deepest with a simple sentence: "My son requires a wife who hasn't given up on being a woman." The words had clung to Lydia the way certain winter colds clung, even when the body pretended they were gone. But this notice? This was different precisely because it was not pretending at all. No poetry. No promises. A contract. A goal. Lydia felt, for the first time in months, the clean relief of a prompt with an obvious answer. She pulled her chair close and composed a message with the same careful structure she taught her students: introduction, credentials, statement of purpose, references, closing. She wrote as a professional, not an applicant in love. To Mr. C. Bonner. I am 32, unmarried, and have taught primary levels for 8 years on Earth. I desire children above all else and can provide a stable, educated home environment. I do not require romantic affection, only mutual respect and the opportunity to be a mother to the child we create. Attached, certifications, references from Reverend Patterson, Cedar Falls Methodist, and Principal Harrison, Cedar Falls Elementary. I can travel at my own expense. Respectfully, Lydia Voss. Her thumb hovered over send. Her reflection in the view screen looked precisely like a woman such a man would choose for an arrangement: neat bun, sensible jacket, eyes that had learned to lower themselves by a degree at the right moment. She pressed. Days passed, then 2 weeks. The station rolled on. Children shrieked at the 0G rec pod. The baby down the corridor developed a laugh. Lydia taught a small math seminar to cover the rent. Every night she slept with her satchel on the chair, teaching certificates, her mother's pearl studs in a little tin, and 3 paper books rescued from a thrift kiosk: Leaves of Grass, Selected Dickinson, and a battered copy of A Child's Garden of Verses with a Cracked Green Spine. Paper was a luxury she allowed herself because it made the future feel heavy enough to hold. The reply came in 14 clipped words through the station's public telegram system. Arrangements acceptable. Ticket issued Des Moines Orbital Silver Creek, arrival November 15th. C. Bonner. No, welcome. No, looking forward. Acceptable. It was enough. Lydia handed in her notice at the station learning lab. Principal Harrison did his best concerned father impression. Miss Voss, I do hope you understand the risk. This is not a school placement, it's, he trailed off delicately. An arrangement, Lydia finished, not unkindly. Yes. That's the point. Her sister Clara flashed into her inbox from Chicago Orbital as soon as she heard, breathless in a way video never quite cured. You don't know him. What if he's cruel? What if this is another one of those frontier men who? What if it isn't? Lydia said, surprised that her voice contained steel she didn't remember sharpening. What if this is the only door that opens when you knock with my kind of hand? Clara didn't have a clean answer to that, because there isn't one. On the morning of November 15th, Lydia rode the shuttle out over a blue planet and into the star-scattered dark with everything she owned pressed into the shape of a single satchel. When the blaze of Des Moines fell away behind her and the Perseus routes unfolded in tidy glowing strings, she set her palm against the window and whispered a simple prayer to whatever watched over women who refused to stop wanting: give me a life I can be good in. In the cold between systems, no one answered out loud. But sometimes silence says, keep going. Chapter 2, Planetfall at Silver Creek. Silver Creek was the sort of colony a surveyor would draw when told to imagine competence. Its modules landed true, stacked true, and stayed true despite winds that could sand a steel plate to satin. From the shuttle viewport, Lydia saw tidy lines of energy turbines stepping across the ridge, greenhouse domes glittering like soap bubbles trapped in a net, and a long, low complex of barns and workshops cupped in the palm of a wide valley. On the far horizon, mountains sat with their shoulders wrapped in purple. The shuttle kissed down and shrugged its seams. Lydia's legs wobbled under gravity's particular humor after 2 days of transit. The air tasted mineral cold and clean, the kind of air that made teeth feel new. She stepped into it and understood why men came to such places determined to own them. He was waiting. Of course he was. He stood where a man who controlled his time would stand, in the lee of the comms tower, where he could see arrivals without being seen from the town's little plaza. 35, Lydia guessed, his dark hair close cropped against the weather, a coat cut to functional elegance, boots that had met mud but hadn't surrendered to it. The first thing she noticed was not his height or the breadth of his shoulders. It was his stillness, the particular posture of someone who expected the world to cooperate with his decisions. "Miss Voss," he said, and his voice had the bone-deep resonance of a man used to speaking at maps. "Mr. Bonner." She extended her hand. He took it briefly, a contact that felt less like greeting than confirmation. The vehicle he led her to was a skimmer built for range rather than show, matte black, scar-polished, quiet as certainty. Its cabin was upholstered in durable red synth that held heat like a hand. They slid into their seats and the skimmer lifted, whispering over packed snow and salt grass toward the Bonner complex. "The ranch is 12 miles from town center," he said, eyes on the landscape. "We can discuss the particulars en route." Our arrangement, Lydia thought, and adjusted her hands, which had chosen to fold themselves neatly in her lap at some point without permission. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 15 years. Bought the initial 160 hectares on borrowed credit at 20. Expanded to 8,000. 3,000 head of bio-bison in rotation, plus horses and repair stock. 12 full-time riders, seasonal contracts during roundups and branding. House operations under Pearl Haskins. The numbers came unadorned, like coordinates. "And my role?" He looked at her then, fully. The gray of his eyes wasn't cold, it was like shaded steel, meant for work, not for winter. "Your role is to conceive and bear my child. Everything else is secondary." There it was, the line drawn in permanent ink. Lydia felt heat rise under her collar, but she made herself nod. "Don't dislike the words for being honest," she thought. "I understand," she said. "You understand the terms," he corrected. "Understanding me is not required." She didn't look away. Perhaps not required. Perhaps useful. A muscle in his jaw marked the comment and then let it go. They rode in a silence that was not unfriendly so much as unoccupied. As the skimmer crested the last rise, the Bonner compound unfolded below them like a plan executed without mercy for sloppiness. The central residence under a weathered glass canopy, attached galleries, a library marked by warm bronze light, the conservatory, barns, a landing pad, lines of solar and wind feeding into tidy battery houses. Everything plumb, everything clean. "It's magnificent," Lydia almost said, but what he had built met the eye like a solved equation. She understood that he would prefer profitable. Pearl Haskins met them at the main door with a palm slate and an expression that could inventory souls. Late 50s, maybe, the posture of a woman who did not have to announce her authority for it to be obeyed. "You'll be answering to Pearl for household matters," Clyde said, already half-turned toward a side entrance. "Dinner at 1900. We'll formalize the agreement then." "Come along," Pearl said, and it sounded like a kindness despite itself. Lydia's assigned room was larger than the whole of her last apartment. A canopy bed like a quiet boat. A wardrobe that hissed open to reveal garments in her sizes, practical and fine, wool for cold, linen for inside, a split riding skirt she didn't yet know how to wear, a coat with heated seams. On the dresser, someone had arranged a tin that looked suspiciously like the kind that once held her mother's pearls. This one held a small medallion printed with the Bonner brand, a stylized creek under a crescent, attached to a simple chain. It was not a claim, not yet. It was a welcome that pretended it wasn't. "It's generous," Lydia said softly. "Mr. Bonner doesn't do things by halves," Pearl replied. "And he doesn't do them without purpose." She tapped the slate. 7 is 7. He hates wasting heat and time the same way he hates sloppy floors. When Pearl left, Lydia stood by the tall window and watched the riders exercise horses in a corral that looked cut from dark glass. Their movements had the easy economy of people who had learned their tasks down to the finger bones. Every piece of this place had a job, and every job made sense. Dinner smelled like roasted root and spice from the hydroponics house. The plates were real china. The flatware reflected the light in precise lines. They ate without small talk. When the main course cleared and Pearl poured coffee, Clyde said, "Shall we?" and led her to his study. If the residence was functional elegance, the study was a statement. Dark paneled walls hung with old maps of Earth and new maps of this place. A massive desk that could have been a door once. Above it, a portrait of an older man whose mouth had been set to disapprove, but whose eyes looked tired of the work. Clyde opened a leather ledger and clicked a pen. "I believe in clarity. We will establish the rules." He numbered them. "First, your primary obligation is to conceive and bear my child. The charter prefers a son but recognizes any healthy issue. The language is archaic and absurd, but I didn't write it. Second, during pregnancy, you will follow Dr. Morrison's recommendations to the letter. He's the best on world. Third, you are not to engage in ranch operations. We have foremen and an AI accounting stack for that. Your sphere is the house and, eventually, the nursery. Fourth, you will receive a monthly stipend for personal expenses, 50 credits. Pearl manages household budgets. Fifth, no correspondence with former suitors without my approval. I won't have questions about paternity or intent." "I have no correspondence," Lydia said. It was true in a way letters always were, selective. "Good. Sixth, social obligations will be limited to necessary functions, church, a quarterly town forum when votes are tallied, 2 or 3 fundraisers. Your presence is sometimes necessary for optics, and you will comport yourself accordingly. Seventh," he paused, not dramatically, but as a man measuring a word's weight before lifting it. "Seventh, the intimate aspect of our arrangement will begin when Dr. Morrison confirms medical compatibility. We will continue until pregnancy is established. Then we will revisit cadence." He said it as gently as you can say something like that without lying about what it is. Lydia found she appreciated the effort. "And after the child is born?" she asked. "What is my position then?" "You will raise the child. Provide education, moral guidance, the things mothers provide." His pen hovered. "I do not intend to remarry. This is not a trial for a wife, it is a contract for an heir." The sentence hit the room and settled. Lydia took a breath. "Then I agree," she said, because the woman who had answered the notice had walked all this way on that answer. "On one condition of my own." His eyebrow registered faint curiosity. "Name it." "Kindness," Lydia said. "Not romance. You've removed that from the table. But respect. Courtesy. No contempt in my own home. Silence. The kind that counts seconds for the record." "Then, I am not cruel," Clyde said. "I don't break animals. I don't belittle staff. I won't abuse you. I also won't invent feelings to ease the optics." "Good," she said. "We understand each other, then." "We understand the terms," he corrected again, but the word understand came out softer. He signed. She signed. The ledger closed with a neat, almost satisfied sound. On the wall, the old man in the painting looked away as if numbers embarrassed him in public. When Lydia stepped back into the corridor, the wind made the glass sing in the conservatory. She went to the library because the hour was too sharp for bed and because books were the only people who didn't mind that she sometimes needed space before sleep. The shelves, real wood, carried everything from soil reclamation manuals to a paper-spined Whitman whose binding had been mended with care rather than competence. Lydia smiled despite herself and took it down. She was still reading when the door opened and Clyde paused in the threshold as if caught trespassing. No whiskey in his hand. No ledger. Only the expression of a man surprised to discover that his house had more rooms than he used. Restless thoughts. Lydia asked, because teachers learn to ask the question a student will not. He glanced at the book in her lap. Sometimes. Warm milk, she said. Helps. Whiskey, he countered. Sometimes. Their eyes met for a moment that felt like a blacksmith's pause, right before iron learns a new shape. Then he nodded once and left her to the poem and the civilized hiss of a heater doing its job. Lydia read the line she had always loved, "I am large, I contain multitudes," and tried not to think about men who didn't believe that sentence applied to them. Chapter 3, Terms with a Pulse. Dr. Morrison arrived at dawn riding a snow-dusted skimmer like a man who had finally made peace with the ways frontier machinery refused to care about his degrees. 60, maybe older, a tidy mustache, eyes that had seen enough births and losses to speak plainly without being unkind. Pearl supervised the exam with the same brisk decorum she applied to inventory checks. "We don't leave things to chance out here," she said as she marked a chart. "Chance already took its bite." "Excellent health," Dr. Morrison said when he finished, satisfaction softened by genuine pleasure. "Strong lungs. Clean labs. No genetic flags in the panel we ran from your intake. You'll do very well here, Miss Voss." "You'll do," Lydia heard, stripped of adverbs, and decided not to flinch. Doing well was her specialty. Doing warmly, well. That was why she was here, wasn't it? To make warm out of strict. Routine settled over her days like something knitted by a patient ant. Breakfast at 7 in the morning room, which faced east and turned the first light into polite gold. Clyde read news squibs and market briefs and weather models, occasionally summarizing without commentary. Lydia learned the layout of the house and then the compound, library, conservatory, the writer's barracks, the machine shop that smelled like hot metal and competence. Mornings she volunteered in the greenhouses, gladly surrendering to the serious joy of dirt under her nails. Afternoons she walked beneath the covered lanes between modules and learned the wind's grammar, when it said stay inside, when it said hurry home, when it said look up, I'm about to tell you something you'll want to remember. In the evening she found her way to the library and the drawer where someone had tucked the paper Whitman, careful of its failing spine. Sometimes she read with a finger marking each line like a pulse. Sometimes she simply held the book and listened to the house settle. On the third night, sleeplessness pressed her out of bed and toward the kitchen. She stood at the big enamel pot warming milk and felt like an intruder in her own arrangement. Footsteps sounded in the hall, a rhythm different from Pearl's practical clip. Clyde appeared in the doorway, bare forearms, collar open, an expression that looked almost human. "Milk," he said, as if the word were a foreign greeting he'd decided to try. "My mother swore by it for thoughts that wouldn't lie down." Lydia poured a second mug on instinct and slid it across the counter. He took it, grip careful, as if he'd never held anything meant to soothe. "What were you looking for?" he asked after the first sip, "when you answered the notice?" "Work I could be good at," Lydia said truthfully. "And a home that made room for the part of me that refuses to stop wanting." He leaned against the counter as if it were allowed. "You should know," he said, looking into the milk as though it might give him the next word, "I've done this before. Not the contract. The trying. I married young. Margaret. She left. She said the frontier was too lonely, that I was too much like this place, useful, unsentimental, always working." Perhaps she wanted something shiny, Lydia said, surprising herself with the warmth that rose to defend a man who had made a point of not promising her anything. "Not something that lasts." He huffed a sound that wasn't a laugh but had the shape of one. "Or perhaps I was exactly what she said I was." "You built this," Lydia said, gesturing toward the window where the turbines cut the night with their unending patience. "You hold it together so children in town can sleep through a winter squall without wondering if the lights will come back on. You stock a library with poetry even if you never let anyone see you in it. Men like that are not the problem." He watched her for a long heartbeat. The room held still around the mugs. "You speak like a teacher," he said. "I am one," she said, and waited for contempt. "Good," he said instead, shocking them both. Silver Creek could use one. They stood like that, side by side, not touching, watching snow filaments spider across the glass of the kitchen door. The wind had begun to talk in its hungry voice. Lydia felt it in the bones of the house and in the small bones of her hands. She lifted the mug again and thought, a contract is not a cage. A contract is a tool. Tools can build. The next morning, Clyde was waiting by the equipment bay when she came down from the residence wing in her borrowed riding coat. A second coat lay across his forearm, heavier, with seams that glowed faintly where heating elements threaded the weave. "Come," he said, as if the decision had been made by weather. "I want to show you the north pasture." "You'll have me break your rule about operations," Lydia said, half teasing, half testing. He didn't smile, not exactly. But the corner of his mouth conceded the point. "We'll call it education." They took the skimmer out past the greenhouse ring and across the rolling silica grass, the blades glinting in thin winter sun. Herds moved in slow dark commas across the pale. Drone shepherds kept their tidy distance, adjusting with the weather's moods. On the ridges, wind towers revolved like patient sentries. The world looked engineered and wild in the same breath. "This is where we started," Clyde said when they topped a hill and the valley unrolled below, compound small as a toy, town smaller, the river cutting a line like a scar. 160 hectares, 2 riders, 6 stubborn horses, a bank loan, and a very loud idea that I would be the sort of man who could do something with a map and a chance. "And are you?" Lydia asked. He considered the question as if she were a reporter and not the woman he'd hired to save him from a clause. "I became him," he said finally. "Out here, if you don't, you find somewhere else to be." They stood by the skimmer and let the air do what air does best far from cities, remind people of their size. Out of the corner of her eye, Lydia saw his hands move. Not to touch. To still. He had learned to pin his own untidiness to the board. She wondered how heavy the pins were. "You know," she said, "on Earth we tell children the frontier is for brave people." "It is for obedient people," Clyde said. Obedient to the math of weather. To the physics of supply chains. To the truth that wanting doesn't exempt you from outcomes. "Maybe it's for people who can do both," Lydia said, because she couldn't help it, because it was what she taught, equation and poem, both true, both necessary. He didn't answer. But when he swung back into the skimmer, he offered a hand, and when she took it, he didn't drop it the instant the transfer of weight was complete. That night at dinner, the quiet between them had edges sanded off. Pearl noticed and didn't comment, which was Pearl's way of blessing things without putting them on the chore list. After coffee, Clyde didn't lead Lydia to the study. He walked with her to the library instead and let himself be seen standing where men like him do not stand, in front of a shelf of poems. "I won't ask you to read out loud," Lydia said gently. He shook his head, a short, almost embarrassed smile. "Whitman? Really? You disapprove?" "I disbelieved," he said. "Less now." They didn't read. They simply were, in the soft lamplight, in the warmth of a room that kept a record of what mattered enough to keep. The wind rose, loud at the windows. The heater clicked its regular click. Somewhere out in the compound a rider called to a horse in a low, serious voice and was answered by a whicker that traveled like a rumor. Lydia listened, and her heart did something dangerous and useful at once, it adjusted the plan to include joy. Chapter 4, Riding the Star Prairie. Morning came blue and clean, as if the sky had been sanded overnight. Frost feathered the greenhouse panes and the turbines carved the wind into obedient segments. When Lydia stepped into the equipment bay, Clyde was already there with 2 rider suits charging on a rack and a skimmer idling like a patient animal. "You'll need this," he said, passing her a helmet whose visor carried a neat ribbon of data, temperature, wind vector, local field strength. North pasture. The storm models are interesting. "Interesting," Lydia said, sliding her hands into heated gloves. "The way doctors say you may feel a small pinch." He glanced at her, that not quite smile again. "Yes. Exactly like that. They skimmed out across the prairie, keeping low where the land folded itself into long windbreaks. The silica grass whispered against the lift field. Herds moved like spilled ink. Far off, a flock of maintenance drones skimmed the ridgeline, their bellies glinting. Clyde narrated the terrain as if he had written it, which draws held snow late, which gullies turned treacherous under an east wind, where the creek would flood if the mountain shoulders shrugged too fast. His voice warmed by degrees, the way metal loses its chill in a well-used hand. "Why here?" Lydia asked when they paused above a basin that cupped a pond thinly cased in ice. "You could have taken a refinery contract on a core world. Bought an apartment with windows that show only what you pay them to." "My father expected that," Clyde said, and the admission seemed to cost him a measured, exact amount. "Banking. Suits. Marry a girl whose family name opens the right doors. Spend a life trading other people's chances. He said I was too emotional to be a good ledger, too prone to impulse." "You. Emotional?" Lydia teased gently. Perish the thought. He watched the wind rake the grass and did not look at her. "I came here because no one would give me credit for being the sort of man I meant to be until I forced the math. You buy land. You learn it down to the bone. You keep people paid and the lights on, and when storms come you tell fear to stand aside because there's work." "And does fear listen?" she asked. "It negotiates," he said, and she heard the honesty in it. They dismounted and stood with the skimmer humming at their backs, watching a pair of riders work a string of horses through a pattern that looked like choreography, and necessity had had a child. Lydia breathed until her lungs remembered what they were for. She thought of her smallest students on earth, the ones who needed a hand on the shoulder just to try a new letter. Safe is not the same as still, she told herself. Here is not the same as alone. "You know," she said softly, "you speak of this place like a person." "It is," he said without apology. "It's temperamental and demanding and gives back exactly what you put in plus weather." "Children do, too," Lydia said. For a moment, the ridge held its breath. Clyde turned, and the gray of his eyes did a dangerous, necessary thing, it softened. "Children do," he agreed. "Our children." The word pitched and settled. "Our." It landed somewhere behind Lydia's ribs and went on glowing. She nodded because she didn't trust her voice to manage anything more complex than consent. They rode longer than they needed to, as if the wind had more to teach. On the way back, they passed the battery houses, tidy blocks of stored light, and Clyde slowed, eyeing the updrafts, the taste of the air. He snapped the visor menu open and called weather feeds with quick, precise motions Lydia had already learned to read as concern he will not voice unless he must. "Forecast moved," he said. "How bad?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon, where a band of blue had taken on a thin, mean sheen. Bad enough to tie things down early. By afternoon, the alert had gone colony-wide. CreekNet sent the standard prep checklists. Pearl began to marshal bodies like a general who enjoyed her work and her soldiers in equal measure. Dr. Morrison opened a first response station in the clinic module and tucked blankets into every space that looked like it might need them. The riders brought the herds closer to the windbreaks and double-wired the gates. The whole colony drew breath together and got on with it. At sundown, Lydia stood at the library window and watched the sky stack itself in hard, metallic layers. The turbines turned toward the coming wind like hounds scenting a storm. Clyde came up beside her, shoulders easy, mouth not. "The field will get noisy," he said. "Inside the dome is safest." "I'll make the library a shelter," Lydia said. "It has interior walls and no exterior vents. We can stack mattresses in the reading room. The children know the space. They won't be as afraid." Clyde's glance flicked to her, approval as brief and bright as a struck match. "Good," he said. "I'll be on the grid until it stabilizes." "Come back," she said, "because bravery and asking can hold hands." "I will," he said, as if the word were a contract he intended to keep. They did not touch. They did not need to. The window hummed and the first snow dust rose and the colony braced for the weather and whatever rode in on it. The frontier stopped pretending. Chapter 5, The Ion Storm. It started as a sound, low, curious, like a giant touching the dome with the back of its knuckles. Then the light shifted, a faint violet fever that ran through metal and blood alike. CreekNet hiccuped as the ionization layer thickened overhead. The storm rolled itself into the valley and tried the doors. Lydia had moved the library tables against the walls and laid mattresses in long neat rows. Pearl appeared with thermoses and a box of metal cups that had seen 100 storms and never complained. Children came in on parent hips or holding older siblings' sleeves, eyes wide, voices thin with the kind of excitement that hides inside fear. Lydia made them a game of it because games are disguises for courage. "Find the book with the bluest cover," she said to a knot of 6-year-olds. "Then bring it to me and tell me why it is the bluest and not just blue." They scattered, their minds redirected onto a problem they could win. She chalked tasks on the glass wall with a grease pencil because writing makes plans official. Vent seals. Checked. Emergency lanterns. Lit. Analog radio. Warming. Roster, Pearl plus Harris plus Thompson plus Lydia. Dr. Morrison on call. Children assigned, paired. Adult watch, hourly rotations. She drew a box around kind words only and another around hands we hold count twice. The dome flexed like a whale breathing. The violet light climbed the shelves. 2 teenagers, bravado slipping, argued in that brittle way fear has of disguising itself as superiority. Lydia sent them to inventory blankets and count by 5s. Pearl watched her over the ridge of a thermos, then gave the smallest nod in the cosmos, the one leaders use when they have found another leader and the planet is about to get better. The radio crackled, the analog set that ignored the behaving badly physics overhead. North grid bracing, Clyde's voice said, thin with distance, steady with choice. Voltage spikes containable if the turbine ring doesn't misbehave in chorus. Lydia's hand tightened on the mic, library shelter established. "We have 43 souls here, mostly children and elders. We're fine." "Good." A breath. "If you lose main heat, move them to the basement stacks. They hold better." "Copy," Lydia said. The word felt more useful than be careful, and she kept the softness behind her teeth because some words are private in a public emergency. They did not get to keep the emergency to themselves. The door alarm blapped, an ugly sound meant to be obeyed. Harris, tall, gentle, forearms like fence rails, looked at Pearl, who looked at Lydia. "I've got it," Lydia said, and went with Harris because teachers know you do not open a door without backup. They unsealed the airlock to find 3 figures in cheap suits and cheaper decisions. Their helmets were scuffed, the emblem on one sleeve had been torn off in a hurry, the sort of men who live between the columns of other people's ledgers. The first one raised his hands palms out, a gesture older than rockets. Behind his visor his eyes were the color of people who hadn't eaten enough in a while. "Storm knocked our buggy," he said through the tinny speaker. "We just need heat, till it passes. We'll go. No trouble." Lydia scanned the sky automatically, as if the storm might be trying to lie with its face. She did not see other shapes. That didn't mean they weren't there. She considered the calculus, 3 strangers, 43 dependents, a storm mean enough to do math with knives. Pearl's voice came low and flat over the local channel at Lydia's ear. "If they're the tip of a pry bar, we're the wood. Or we make them the wedge that holds the door shut," Lydia murmured back. She stepped forward, every line of her body unafraid on purpose. "We can't take you into the main room," she told the men. "Too many children. But the vestibule stays warm if we open the inner vents. Harris will take your helmets. Pearl will scan you for weapons. You will keep your hands where we can love them properly if they do nothing foolish." The first man made a sound that wanted to be a laugh and failed because his throat didn't have space for it. "Love?" Words matter, Lydia said. Even to scoundrels. Do we have a deal? He looked at his companions, at the storm, at the woman with a grease pencil still in her hand like a baton. Something in him recognized the rules and the relief of having them. Deal, he said. They stripped to undersuits and shivered into the vestibule. Pearl took a knife and a palm stunner with the bored competence of someone who had taken those exact items from better men. Harris dragged in a crate of ration bars and set it where it could be seen and not taken. Lydia cracked the inner vents and watched their shoulders lower by a fraction. She put 3 tin cups in their hands and called it tea even though it was just hot water. "You're making a mistake, lady," one of them muttered, more bewildered than threatening. "You don't know us." "I know the math," Lydia said. "If this dome goes, you die with us. Help me keep it up and you leave with your fingers. Those are the terms." Their leader stared at her a moment longer. Then he nodded once, that same small, exact motion of agreement the frontier reserved for people who had remembered how to be useful. "What do you need?" "Muscle and monotony," Pearl said from the scanner with grim delight. "Plenty of both, I'm sure." They worked. The vestibule men cycled sandbags into the tunnel that linked the library to the clinic, because heavy doors get heavier when the wind decides to prove a point. Harris and Thompson secured a bucking vent that had decided it was a kite. Lydia kept the small ones occupied with a book hunt and the larger ones with jobs: fold blankets into thirds, count lanterns, write names on the chalked roster in tidy lines. The radio crackled again, a burst of static with Clyde under it. "Grid holding. Turbine 6 wants to sing with the others. It's a bad singer. I'm going to ask it politely to shut up." "Copy," Lydia said, ignoring the way her heart did a small, treacherous leap every time his voice made it through the noise. "We have 3 guests in the vestibule. They're earning their heat." Silence. "Then, your call," Clyde said, which is a sentence some men never learn and good men use like gifts. "Trust your read." Lightning, if you could call it that when it crawled Violet along the dome ribs like a cat, arched and spat. The children gasped and then laughed because Lydia gasped first and then laughed, modeling as she had taught herself to do even when the act did not come easy. The vestibule men passed sandbags down a line to Harris, who nodded a soldier's thanks he hadn't earned and made it look like he had. Hours thickened. The storm pounded its logic and found the dome stubborn. Inside, the temperature bumped and fell and bumped again. Lydia made games and lists and put her hand on the back of anyone who needed to be reminded that hands exist for more than carrying. Pearl moved through the room with her clicker and her grim affection and quietly placed a thin blue blanket over the shoulders that shook hardest. At some hour that had no name, Clyde came through the door with his helmet under his arm and his hair standing up as if electricity had tried to teach it a trick. He looked like the storm had bitten him and decided he tasted like metal. "Your grid?" Lydia asked. "Holding," he said. "Because people did what they were told and machines remembered their jobs." "And you?" He opened his mouth to make a joke he hadn't earned and closed it again. "I'm all right," he said instead. He saw the vestibule men and lifted a brow at Lydia. She lifted one back. "We made a choice." He nodded. Then it was the right one. Between leaders, this counted as a hug. The storm burned itself down to a hard shine and then, as storms do when met with competence and ordinary courage, it ran out of itself. The violet drained from the glass. CreekNet stopped hiccuping and started lecturing. Someone laughed too loud and didn't apologize. Someone else wept quietly and was handed a cup. Pearl released the vestibule men their knife and palm stunner with a look that promised she could take them again if bored. Lydia packed a sack with ration bars and a roll of sealant tape and wrote the word "choice" on a scrap of paper and tucked it in on top. Their leader blinked at it. "What's that for?" "To remind you you made one," she said. "And that it's still there next time." He swallowed, that same thick motion of a person unused to swallowing anything but pride. "Lady, you're not from the places I know." "No," Lydia said softly. I'm from the places I want to build. They left without incident. Harris sealed the lock. The library exhaled. By morning, Silver Creek had a power grid that could still recite its multiplication tables, a dome that had earned its keep, and a story it would tell in winters to come, how a teacher turned a library into a shelter and made pirates into sandbaggers with nothing but a pencil and the audacity to assume men might be better than their last bad decision. Clyde stood in the doorway and watched Lydia chalk the words "Thank you for your work" on the glass for every pair of eyes to read. He rubbed a smudge of soot from his wrist and looked like a man doing math on a page that had never before contained the variables he found in front of him. "Lydia," he said when the room quieted to murmurs, "we need to talk. But first, sleep." Later, Lydia agreed, because wisdom is also a schedule. They did not say proud or afraid or glad you're here. They ate broth out of cups and then fell onto mattresses and let the sun crawl up the dome like a careful animal. Outside, the storm had shifted the world back into itself. Inside, something had shifted the contract. Chapter 6, The Charter and the Promise. The sky over Silver Creek resumed its cold, ordinary blue, the exact color of systems that would, barring interference, continue. People came out into it like plants tilting toward light. The riders checked fences. The clinic counted its bandages. Pearl inventoried, scolded, forgave, and fed, not necessarily in that order. Midday brought a packet from the charter office in town, a neat, officious ping on the resident slate that meant someone who doesn't live here has thoughts about how you should. Pearl carried it in with 2 fingers as if it might smear. Clyde read it standing up. His mouth did that hard, flattened thing that looked like anger and counted as resolve. "What?" Lydia asked, because she had earned the question with her night's work and because fear and curiosity sometimes share a cup. "Early review," he said. "The committee is moving the timeline up. We either demonstrate an heir in process or a legally recognized co-governor this quarter, or the syndicate gets to make a case for repossession at year-end." He laid the slate down as if it weighed as much as a turbine blade. "They're emboldened by storm damage reports out on the rim. Weak colonies fold. They're looking for blood. If they came through the library last night," Lydia said, calm because panic is a poor student, "they'd know we don't fold." "They didn't," he said. "And that's the problem. They'll read numbers but not the room. They'll weigh debts and ignore work." He turned then, as if remembering the order of operations that had brought him to this line. "Lydia." Her name came out like the beginning of a speech written the hard way. He wiped his hand once on his sleeve, as if to remove the storm from it, and failed. "When I wrote that notice, I wanted to solve a problem without introducing variables. I thought a child would satisfy the charter and keep the ledger clean. Last night, you stood a whole town up against a storm and taught men I wouldn't have fed to hold bags for children. You changed the equation." He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He stood exactly where a man should stand when he's about to do something dangerous and generous, inside his own skin, within reach if invited. "I don't want an arrangement," he said, voice low and sure. "I want a partner. I want you as my wife and as co-governor of this place. I want to write it down and say it out loud and let the town witness it. Not because the committee prefers the optics, but because I do. Lydia Voss, will you marry me?" For a fraction of a second, the room didn't know what to do with the air. Pearl, busying herself sternly at the sideboard, went so motionless a cat would have curled up on her if one had dared enter the house. Lydia felt the storm surge back through her, quick and bright, but this time it delivered heat without burn. She could have teased him. She could have said something precise and clever about timing and charters. Instead she took one careful step that covered a lifetime and stood where his resolve could meet hers without breaking. "Yes," she said, and then remembered she had terms of her own, and that love and boundaries also share a cup. "On conditions." He exhaled something that might have been a laugh and might have been a prayer. "Of course. 1. A real wedding," Lydia said. "Public. Honest. Not a line item in a ledger. I want every child who slept under my roof last night to see what choosing each other looks like. Done, he said. 2. Co-governance in fact, not just in title. I want access to Ledger, 13 and the ranch accounts. I want to build the school as a first-class module, not a warmed closet. I want a seat at the operations table when storms and men behave badly. Done, he said again, and the word had the texture of relief. 3. We don't lie about feelings to make people easier to manage. Not to the town. Not to ourselves. Clyde swallowed and the movement was unguarded enough to feel like a vow. I will try and fail and try better, he said. Done. 4. We build something that outlasts us that isn't just profit, Lydia said, because sometimes teachers assign the extra credit they most want to grade. A school. A library that remains free. A way of making strangers into neighbors. Clyde's hand, still at his side, still disciplined, curled just enough to betray him. I have never wanted anything more, he said. Done. Pearl made a sound that was not a sniff and not a sob, then banged a pot lid and said gruffly, well, if you're going to make a spectacle of it, I suppose I'd better sterilize the kitchen between now and then so the core world guests don't die of frontier. Pearl, Lydia said, choking on a laugh and not minding the stumble, will you stand with me? Pearl turned with her chin high, eyes sharp, mouth soft. I will, she said. And I'll make sure your bouquet doesn't clash with the emergency lanterns. Word ran ahead of them the way water seeks a fall. The town liked weddings the way tired people like songs they know all the words to. Dr. Morrison dusted off a suit and pretended he did not care about fashion. The riders cleaned their boots in a manner that suggested they had boot-cleaning experience from a previous life. The teenagers, those 2 proud boys among them, volunteered to string lanterns and carried ladders like men who had worked storms and would work this one without complaint. Clyde and Lydia went to the charter office together and signed what needed signing, the co-governor forms that gave Lydia read-write access to Ledger, 13, the operational bylaws that added a line item for education module, Silver Creek School, the public notice that set a wedding date 2 weeks hence under the greenhouse dome because the church was too small and, anyway, children needed to see what plants and promises have in common. On the way out, a syndicate representative, slick coat, slicker smile, offered Clyde a pen with the company's name etched along its barrel. If you need bridge financing to make this, romance, palatable to the committee, he said, tone all honey, we have products for that. Clyde looked at the pen as if it were a poorly trained dog. We have a community for that, he said, and did not take it. Outside, the wind combed the grass like a hand that had learned gentleness after a long night of trying other methods. Lydia tucked her hand into the crook of Clyde's arm and felt the way it fit without having to be instructed. Across the plaza, 2 children were drawing with chalk on the paving stones, their letters spiky with effort, their tongues between their teeth in concentration. A school, she thought. A line of desks. A window into winter light. Names on hooks. Books within reach. A place that tells children the world wants them here. Lydia, Clyde said, low. Yes. Thank you for choosing me. She thought about the ad between the stars, about the gray room above a station, about 5 rejections that had shaped her into a woman who could walk through a storm and arrange pirates into usefulness, about a man who had learned to let fear negotiate and then to ask it to step aside. I didn't, she said, and he turned in quick alarm before she finished, I chose us. The word settled into him like heat. Then let's give the committee a definition of us they'll have to file under sustainable infrastructure, he said. Make the category bigger, Lydia said, smiling. Common good. They walked back toward the dome where Pearl was already shouting at a string of lanterns, where teenagers were hooting at each other on ladders, where Dr. Morrison was pretending to read vows off a screen while really writing them in his head. The wind toyed with Clyde's hair. The turbines hummed approval. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a skimmer's engine revved like a happy animal. Silver Creek felt like a phrase finally finding its subject. The charter would have its heir, or its co-governor, or both. The colony would have its school. And the frontier would have to learn a new kind of math, the kind that starts with two people and expands until the answer is a town that refuses to fold. Chapter 7, A Wedding Under Glass. They strung lanterns like little moons under the greenhouse dome, each one catching on a leaf or a length of wire and deciding to stay. The hydroponic rows had never looked so festive, the lettuces crisp and smug, the climbing beans putting on white blossoms like accidental corsages. Pearl stalked the aisle with a fistful of zip ties and a face that said perfection or death, pausing only to remove an offending ribbon that clashed with the emergency strobes. Dr. Morrison arrived in a suit old enough to have opinions. The teenagers, those two boys who had learned humility during the storm, carried benches with the solemnity of altar boys and tried not to grin when Pearl ignored their attempts at swagger and told them where to put their hands. The town came. Riders in cleaned boots. Greenhouse tech still damp from misting. Parents with children stiff and bright in best clothes. Even Harris had combed his hair into a shape that couldn't occur in nature. Someone had set the old speaker in the corner to cycle a playlist of human songs about promising, folk and synth and a hymn that made the dome sound like it remembered Earth. Clyde stood at the front, not in a tuxedo, because this was a colony, not a ball, but in a dark jacket that fit his shoulders and a clean white shirt with a collar that would not lie perfectly flat no matter how Pearl stared at it. His gray eyes took the room in, then found Lydia at the entrance, and whatever was hard in him let go with visible relief. She came on Pearl's arm because parents arrive in all sorts of ways on the frontier. The dress was simple, cream, sleeves to the wrist, hem that would not be ruined by a bad step. Around her throat, the medallion with the Bonner Crescent Creek, now hers and not an emblem of anyone's experiment. When she reached Clyde, Pearl stepped back with an expression that suggested she would brawl anyone who tried to make the bouquet clash with the lighting. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat, found his place on the slate, and then ignored it. "We are here," he said, "because the math of this place says you can't survive alone and because the poetry says you shouldn't want to. A charter is a set of rules, a marriage is a set of chosen rules, revised with kindness. Do you understand?" The room murmured yes and laughed at itself for answering like schoolchildren. He looked at Clyde. "What do you bring?" Clyde didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Lydia as if she were a map he'd finally earned the right to memorize. "I bring a place that will ask a lot of us and give back exactly what we put in, plus weather. I bring the ledger, open. I bring a library I pretended was just for winter nights and a future I used to think was a clause. I bring my hands, which are good at work, and my stubbornness, which is good at storms. I bring my fear and my promise to let you see both." "And what do you ask?" Morrison said. "That she never have to ask for a seat at the table," Clyde said. "That we make this town together the way we kept it last week, by assuming the best and training for the worst. That if I start to think the grid is the only heartbeat that matters, she will put my hand on another." Morrison turned to Lydia. "And you?" Lydia had taught 100 children to say hard things with grace. She drew that skill up now and made it into a vow. "I bring a school," she said, and the room rustled with pleased foreknowledge. "Desks and windows and hooks with names on them. I bring the habit of writing plans where everyone can see them. I bring a conviction that kindness is not soft, it's structured. I bring the word us and my insistence that it includes as many people as possible." "And what do you ask?" Morrison asked. "That he not hide feeling behind the word practical when what he means is afraid," Lydia said. "That when the committee comes with clipboards and narrow boxes, we meet them with evidence and humanity in the same breath. That when a storm knocks, we remember how we held the door last time." "Good," Morrison said. "Very good." He looked to the crowd. "Witnesses." "Witnesses," Pearl said like a gavel and the dome echoed it back, gentle as rain. Rings were plain bands made by the machine shop from scrap titanium smoothed until it had no memory of being anything else. They slid on like decisions made long before anyone said the words. Morrison pronounced what the law required and what the town delighted to enforce. Clyde and Lydia kissed in front of everyone who would later hold them to their promises. The teenagers whooped. The children clapped with that particular ferocity that makes celebrations official. Clyde stepped forward, cleared his throat, and did the thing he had promised. He let feeling stand without dressing it in function. "I thought love was a variable that made operations unstable," he said, and the writers laughed softly at a man brave enough to roast himself at his own wedding. "Then a teacher turned my library into a shelter, taught some men to be better than their last bad choice, and reminded me that the warmest technology we own is each other. Silver Creek, this is my wife and your co-governor. When the charter comes knocking, we will answer together." Pearl snapped her slate shut like the closing of a ship's hatch. "Eat," she commanded, and the party obeyed. There was bread, and stew, and a cake that had fooled even Pearl into believing it would rise. Dr. Morrison danced once, badly, with the greenhouse foreman, and then pretended his knees were empirical constraints. The teenagers hung in the doorway angling for stories they would not admit wanting. Much later, when the lanterns had been unhooked and the children carried home on shoulders, Clyde and Lydia stood alone under the quiet green of leaves and the hum of pumps and said the unnecessary, important words people say when no one is measuring them. Home. Us. Tomorrow. Outside, the turbines turned and turned, and in the east a strip of cold light promised a day. Chapter 8, The Heir of the Stars. The committee arrived in a shuttle that gleamed like a polite threat and wore the expression of people who enjoy their jobs too much. There were 3 of them, a woman with her hair clipped short and a tablet held like a shield, a man with an interest in the corners of rooms, and a younger analyst whose eyes kept darting toward the greenhouse as if wondering whether lettuce is always that happy. They expected to be received by Clyde. They were. But Lydia stood beside him, co-governor insignia bright on her collar, ledger, 13 access key on a lanyard that made the analyst blink twice and check a rule that did not object. "Silver Creek," said the woman, who introduced herself as Director Anwar. "Your early review has 2 paths to compliance, heir evident or co-governance demonstrable. Show us your best case." "We'll show you both," Lydia said. She didn't smile. She made room with her voice and the way she stood for the possibility that this would go well, and for the firmness that it would, regardless. They walked. First, the school module, a long, light space with windows that would not care if winter pressed its face against them. Desks, yes, hooks with names, yes, a low shelf of books with spines turned outward like hands. On one wall, the storm plan was written in broad marker: who does what, where to go, what to say when fear demands tribute. Under it, Lydia had taped a copy of a crayon drawing, 3 figures under a dome in purple lightning, one holding a grease pencil like a wand. "Library safe," the caption declared in phonetic exuberance. "Curriculum?" Anwar asked, stylus ready for objections. "Foundations first," Lydia said. "Math to keep grids honest. Literacy to keep lies expensive. Agriculture, mechanics, first response. Then art, because it turns survival into life. And governance, a rotating council for older students, so they practice running what they will inherit." "Inherit," Anwar repeated, as if tasting the word for clause violations and finding it nutritious. The analyst drifted to the low shelf and ran a finger along the spines. "Paper," they said, almost reverent. "Some things you need to feel," Lydia said. Next, the powerhouse. Clyde narrated the storm logs without adornment, turbine 6 bad chorus, the voltage spikes, how the riders had braced the north grid with ropes and stubbornness. He showed the maintenance schedule and the parts ordered before the storm and not after, which impressed the man who liked corners into saying, "Huh," in a tone that meant competent, annoying to my plans if I had any. "Financials," Anwar said, polite as a guillotine. Clyde opened ledger, 13 on a wall display. Numbers unfolded in tidy rivers. Income, outflow, reserves, risk. He didn't pause when a line item labeled school appeared, or when library hardening and community fund popped like honest weeds in a field. "We publish a summary monthly," he said. "Town hall review. Questions welcome." He looked at Lydia as if the idea had once terrified him and now felt like air. Transparency is admirable, Anwar said blandly, which is committee for we disapprove less than usual. They were heading to the greenhouse when trouble did what trouble does best, tried to make a point at exactly the moment it would count most. A minor sabotage, clumsy in its timing, expensive in its intent. A junction panel near the battery house hissed and spat, then threw a fault out of proportion to its size. "Stay back," the corner man said reflexively, putting an arm in front of Anwar. Clyde was already moving with the calm speed of someone who refuses to rehearse panic. Pearl arrived at a run with a toolkit and a glare that could solder. Harris skidded in behind her carrying an extinguisher as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to be useful in official company. Lydia didn't ask permission. She lowered the master to isolate the fault, snapped the breakers in a sequence she could have done on no sleep, because she had, once, and then turned to the committee with her teacher voice warmed and sharpened. "You will want to know if this is normal," she said. "It is not. It is a clumsy attempt to influence your report by making us look fragile." She held up a small device that had tumbled from the panel, slick, stamped with a Core World Syndicate mark that had no business in this valley. Anwar's eyes thinned, not at Silver Creek, but at the insult to her process. "Security?" she asked. Pearl pointed to the greenhouse roof where a small drone they'd repurposed from crop scouting hovered, camera forward. "Caught your saboteur 10 minutes ago," she said. On the screen, a still image popped up, a slick-coated man from the Charter Office Plaza, the one with the pen and no shame, hands in places they shouldn't be. "We're not fond of being tested by people who weren't here when the sky tried to scrape us off," Pearl added. Anwar inhaled, slow. "Forward all copies to my office," she said, and for the first time today her voice contained feeling. "And to the prosecutor." They resumed the tour. The greenhouse was glorious, rows of leaves holding light like news you want to share, a bed of strawberries Pearl had coaxed into fruiting out of season just to prove a point to the weather, a corner where a child had carefully planted 3 beans and labeled them mine. Under the overhead pipes hung 2 paper cranes, the teenager's work, clumsy, earnest. "Your case is strong," Anwar said finally, stylus laid across her tablet as if the document beneath had decided to comply. "Heir or no, you have demonstrated co-governance in letter and in spirit. The school is standing, the ledger is open, the storm plan is real, and your people," she glanced up at the turbines, the repaired panel, the tidy rows of food, "behave as if they understand that charters are not shelters, communities are." She looked at Lydia's hand where it rested, without theatrics, on the low curve of her belly. "And as to the other path," she said, softer, "evidence is compelling." Lydia didn't blush. She smiled the way women smile when a private joy is acknowledged respectfully and then returned to its proper owners. "We'll take both," she said. They gathered back under the dome for the formality of it. Anwar read the decision into the record, Silver Creek Charter, compliant. Rights renewed. Review interval unchanged. Committee notes excellence in community preparedness and recommends other colonies request their storm plan template. The teenagers high-fived and then pretended Pearl had scolded them into lowering their hands, which she had not. Outside, a small, battered buggy pulled to the edge of town and did not cross the line. The man from the vestibule, the one who had taken the cup of hot water and called it tea, sat behind the wheel. He reached into the passenger seat, held up a bag of salvaged insulators and a coil of wire, and set them carefully on the ground. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. He backed away and was gone. Pearl snorted, pleased. "Choice," she said to no one in particular. That evening, the town gathered in the library, by tradition now, as if storms and vows had sanctified the place. Children sprawled on mattresses that had been rolled into neat bolsters. The teenagers occupied the threshold like bouncers at the door of a story. Harris produced a battered guitar that could find 3 chords and enough courage to try a 4th. Clyde stood before the storm plan and pointed with the tip of a marker as Lydia called on eager hands and corrected gently and made the whole room into a class too interesting to skip. "Hands we hold count twice," she said, tapping the phrase, and the children chorused it back, turning a policy into a song. Later, in the quiet that belonging makes, Lydia and Clyde walked the covered lane between the residence and the library. The sky was a clear, indifferent quilt. The turbines ticked. Somewhere, a foal, first of the spring, tested the air with a soft, delighted snort. Lydia felt the small new life shift under her palm and stopped, breath caught by the moment's generous geometry. "Hello," Clyde said to the air near her hand, and if his voice wobbled, only the turbines heard. "Welcome to the work." They stood like that until the cold asked to be respected. On the porch, Pearl had left 2 mugs with a note in her square, uncompromising hand, milk for restless thoughts. Whitman lay on the table, its mended spine holding, as always. "A man can buy turbines," Lydia said, taking the book and pressing it flat with both palms. "He can buy bolts strong enough to anchor a dome, ink to ink a charter. But he can't buy people who will stand together and mean it." "He can't," Clyde said. "He can choose them. He can become someone worth being chosen by." "We did," Lydia said. "We do," he corrected, and they both felt the tense settle into their bones as the right one for work that never ends. The wind went on being itself. The town went on being better than the math had strictly required. The charter office filed its decision. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a buggy rolled toward a place that might be kinder next time. Under glass and stars, a school opened its doors. If Silver Creek's story reminds you that humans are the warmest technology in a cold universe, like this episode, subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula, and leave us one short comment to keep this campfire burning.